All right, aspirants, let's dive right in. Have you ever stopped to wonder how a standard issue trading company literally built a massive bureaucratic state across the entire Indian subcontinent? I mean, it definitely didn't happen overnight. What we're looking at is a highly deliberate, step-by-step tightening of a constitutional leash by the British Parliament. So in today's explainer, we're going to climb that stepladder of centralization together, taking it from the very first regulatory intervention back in 1773 right up to the very edge of the 1857 revolt.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. We'll hit the dawn of central administration, then fixing flaws in double government, after that, breaking the trade monopoly, followed by the peak of centralization, and we'll wrap up with the final company charter.
All right, Part 1, Dawn of Central Administration. The Regulating Act of 1773 and the Amending Act of 1781.
So our journey kicks off in 1773. Visualizing timelines like this is honestly one of the best hacks for retaining constitutional history for the exam. Just focus your attention on the top half here, from the 1773 Regulating Act down to the 1853 Charter Act. Up until this point, the East India Company was basically running the show entirely on its own terms. But this is the moment Parliament steps in. It's the foundational moment the British government actually recognized the company's political and administrative functions.
The Regulating Act of 1773 kicked things off with a massive shift in executive titles. We get Lord Warren Hastings stepping up as the very first Governor-General of Bengal, and he gets a 4-member executive council to help him out. Before this, you just had the Governor of Bengal, so bumping that title up to Governor-General, well, that was the first massive clue that Bengal was becoming the absolute nerve center of British operations in India.
This is where the wave of centralization really hits. Those formerly independent presidencies, Bombay and Madras, were suddenly thrust right under Bengal's thumb. Previously, they all operated in their own little silos, but now Bombay and Madras are officially answering to Calcutta. Plus, to crack down on some seriously rampant corruption, they established a Supreme Court at Calcutta in 1774 and flat-out prohibited company servants from doing any private trade or taking bribes. Oh, and the company's governing body, the Court of Directors? They were now forced to report directly to the British government on all revenue, civil, and military affairs.
But, as you might guess, that 1773 Act wasn't perfect. The biggest fix came with the 1781 Act of Settlement. Why? Because the newly minted Supreme Court and the Governor-General were constantly stepping on each other's toes. It was creating massive friction. So Parliament had to step in and clearly separate the powers. They declared that the Governor-General and his council couldn't be dragged into the Supreme Court for their official acts. And, importantly, they excluded revenue matters from the court's jurisdiction completely, while also stating the court had to administer the personal law of the defendants, Hindu law for Hindus, Mohammedan law for Muslims.
Moving right along to Section 2, Fixing Flaws and Double Government, Pitt's India Act of 1784 and the Act of 1786.
Now, Pitt's India Act of 1784 is a real game-changer because it established the famous system of double government. It took the company's functions and cleanly sliced them in two. The old Court of Directors was essentially told, hey, you stick to the commercial affairs. Meanwhile, they set up a brand new body back in Britain called the Board of Control, and their sole job was to supervise and direct all the political, civil, military, and revenue operations.
Listen up, because this is a massive differentiator for your prelims. 1784 is the exact moment the British government asserted supreme control and literally branded the territories as British possessions. Think about how huge that terminology shift is. The East India Company isn't just some corporation holding land anymore. They are holding it directly on behalf of the British Crown, with the British government sitting right at the absolute top of the supervisory chain. Just 2 years later, we get the Act of 1786. Honestly, this was basically a targeted intervention to appease Lord Cornwallis. He was a high-profile guy, and he essentially told Parliament, look, I'll only take this Governor-General gig if I get the ultimate final say, and if I get to be Commander-in-Chief. And well, Parliament agreed. They passed this act specifically to give him the power to override his own council in special cases, deeply concentrating executive and military power into the hands of one single person.
All right, on to Section 3, Breaking the Trade Monopoly. The Charter Act of 1813.
Stepping into the 19th century, you can see the progressive dismantling of the company's commercial dominance. The British Industrial Revolution was absolutely booming, and other British merchants desperately wanted in on the Indian market. So the 1813 Act is heavily tested because it officially abolished the company's general trade monopoly, throwing it open to all British merchants, though the company did manage to temporarily cling to its monopoly on tea and trade with China. Beyond trade, this act was socially huge. It explicitly allowed Christian missionaries in India, and it laid down the very first provisions for spreading Western education. It even gave local governments the power to tax individuals, which is a small but really significant step in their administrative reach.
Next up, Section 4, the peak of centralization, the Charter Act of 1833.
Okay, by 1833, we reach the absolute climax of this centralizing tendency. If 1773 was the dawn, 1833 is the high noon of centralized British power. The executive structure levels up again. The Governor-General of Bengal officially transforms into the Governor-General of India. Lord William Bentinck was the first to hold this title. And guys, this wasn't just a fancy name change. It was a massive consolidation. The Governor-General was now vested with all civil and military powers across the entirety of British-possessed India.
We're talking total legislative consolidation here. Regional autonomy was entirely stripped away to create unified pan-Indian laws. Before this, local laws were just called regulations. Now, under this highly centralized structure, laws made by the Governor-General of India were officially called acts. Bombay and Madras were basically reduced to administrative outposts, completely deprived of their power to make their own local rules.
Plus, the 1833 Act finally snuffed out the last little remnants of the company's trade monopolies. Remember that tea and China trade they held on to in 1813? Yeah, that's gone now. The East India Company was permanently reduced from a massive trading enterprise to a mere administrative shell, governing India entirely in trust for His Majesty.
And that brings us to Section 5, the final company charter, the Charter Act of 1853.
This final charter really sets the stage for the absolute end of company rule, acting a lot more like a modern government structure. Crucially, 1853 is the very first time the legislative and executive functions of the Governor-General's Council were completely separated. They finally realized that writing laws for a massive subcontinent required dedicated machinery, so they added 6 new legislative councillors, essentially creating a mini-parliament that actually adopted the very same procedures as the British Parliament back in London.
Now, unlike the failed attempt back in 1833, the 1853 Act successfully opened up the civil services to Indians through the Macaulay Committee. So the covenanted civil service was finally open to Indian talent based on open competition. And interestingly, while everything was heavily centralized, we see the very first tiny seeds of local representation here. Of those 6 new legislative members we just talked about, 4 were appointed by the local provincial governments of Madras, Bombay, Bengal, and Agra. It gave the regions a distant but real voice in central lawmaking.
But here is the absolute writing on the wall. Unlike previous charters in 1793, 1813, and 1833, which all gave the company an explicit 20-year lease, the 1853 Act extended the company's rule without specifying any expiration date. They simply said the company could retain possession on trust for the British Crown. It was a very clear message. The British Parliament was now ready to pull the plug on the company whenever it suited them.
So as you synthesize all these facts for your exam, I want you to consider this relentless 80-year pressure cooker of centralization. Yes, the British built a unified administrative and legal framework, but by entirely centralizing power, alienating local leaders, and stripping away every ounce of regional autonomy, they deeply alienated the very people they were trying to govern. So you have to ask yourself, did this relentless, suffocating grip ultimately serve as the primary trigger for the explosive events of 1857 that wiped out company rule entirely? Food for thought as you review your notes.